In 1337, a single disputed claim to the French throne would ignite a conflict that would rage for over a century. What began as a royal disagreement would transform into one of history's longest and most devastating wars, reshaping two entire nations forever. Before we step onto these blood-soaked battlefields together, I need you to make a choice. Just like the soldiers at Agincourt, you must decide your allegiance. Hit subscribe to join the French resistance, smash that like button to ride with the English knights, and drop a comment below telling me, if you lived in 1337, which side would you die for? Your engagement literally keeps this channel alive, unlike most of the nobles we're about to meet. The origins of conflict. The story begins with a succession crisis that would tear Europe apart. When Charles IV of France died in 1328, he left no male heir. The French crown passed to his cousin Philip VI, the first king of the House of Valois. But across the English Channel, King Edward III had his own claim to the French throne through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France. For 9 years, Edward accepted Philip as the rightful king of France. But tensions grew over territorial disputes. The French supported Scotland against England, while Edward harbored rebellious French nobles. The final straw came when Philip confiscated Edward's Duchy of Gascony in southwestern France. On November 1, 1337, Edward III formally claimed the French throne. He declared himself the rightful king of France and England. This single act would plunge both nations into a conflict that would span 5 generations. The war began not with great battles, but with raids and sieges. Edward's strategy was simple. He would devastate French territory to force Philip into battle. In 1338, English forces landed in Flanders, beginning a campaign of destruction that would become the war's defining characteristic. The French initially avoided direct confrontation. Philip VI understood that his kingdom was wealthier and more populous than England. He could afford to wait, but Edward's raids were causing real damage to French trade and agriculture. Something had to be done. The first great victory, Sluys. The first major engagement came at sea. On June 24, 1340, English and French fleets met in the harbor of Sluys in Flanders. The French had assembled a massive fleet to prevent further English landings. They chained their ships together in the harbor, creating a floating fortress. Edward III personally led the English attack. His ships carried hundreds of longbowmen, whose arrows could pierce armor at long range. The French relied on their traditional heavy cavalry, but horses are useless at sea. The Battle of Sluys was a massacre. English arrows rained down on the packed French ships. When the English finally boarded, they found decks slippery with blood. Nearly the entire French fleet was destroyed. Over 16,000 French sailors died that day. The victory gave England control of the English Channel. French ports lay open to English raids. But more importantly, it established a pattern that would define the war. English longbows defeating French knights. The Breton War of Succession. While Edward and Philip maneuvered for advantage, a separate conflict erupted in Brittany. When Duke John III died without an heir, 2 claimants emerged, John de Montfort and Charles de Blois. Montfort was supported by England, while Blois had French backing. This proxy war became a training ground for the larger conflict. Young English and French nobles learned warfare in Breton castles and fields. They developed the tactics and strategies that would shape the greater war. The fighting in Brittany was particularly brutal. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Civilians suffered as much as soldiers. The conflict introduced new levels of violence to medieval warfare. Quarter was rarely given. Prisoners were routinely executed. One incident stands out for its cruelty. In 1342, English forces captured the Breton town of Rennes. They found the townspeople had supported the French cause. In retaliation, they burned the entire city. Men, women, and children died in the flames. This was total war, centuries before the term was invented. Economic warfare and the wool trade. The 100 Years' War was not just fought with swords and arrows. Both sides used economic weapons to damage their enemies. England's greatest advantage was its control of the wool trade with Flanders. Flemish cities like Bruges and Ghent depended on English wool for their textile industries. When Edward III banned wool exports to French-controlled territories, Flemish workers faced unemployment and starvation. This economic pressure forced many Flemish cities to support England against France. The French responded by disrupting English shipping and raiding English coastal towns. French pirates, with royal support, attacked English merchant vessels in the Channel. These raids brought the war directly to English shores. In 1339, French forces raided Portsmouth and Southampton on the English coast. They burned houses, killed civilians, and carried off valuable goods. These attacks terrified the English population and showed that the Channel was no protection against French retaliation. The economic war had another important consequence. It forced both kingdoms to find new sources of revenue. Traditional feudal levies were insufficient for sustained warfare. Both Edward and Philip had to create new taxes and find new ways to raise money. The Black Prince emerged. By 1343, Edward III's eldest son was old enough to participate in the war. Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, was 16 years old when he first took the field. His presence would transform the conflict's character. The Black Prince embodied the new style of English warfare. He was trained from childhood to fight alongside common soldiers. He understood the value of disciplined archery and coordinated tactics. Most importantly, he was willing to engage in the kind of devastating raids that terrorized French civilians. In 1345, the Black Prince led his first independent campaign in Gascony. His army was small but highly effective. They moved quickly through French territory, burning crops, destroying mills, and capturing livestock. This strategy, called chevauchée, was designed to demonstrate the French king's inability to protect his subjects. The psychological impact was enormous. French peasants saw English soldiers ravaging their lands, while French knights remained safe in their castles. This undermined faith in the feudal system and encouraged local nobles to make separate peace agreements with England. Preparations for Crécy. By 1346, both sides were preparing for a decisive campaign. Philip VI had assembled the largest army France had seen in decades. Knights came from across the kingdom, eager to win glory against the English invaders. The French army numbered over 25,000 men, including the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. Edward III's army was much smaller, perhaps 12,000 men, but it was better organized and more experienced. Most importantly, it included over 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. These men could shoot 12 arrows per minute at ranges up to 300 yards. The difference in military culture was profound. French knights fought for personal glory and honor. They competed with each other for the chance to charge the enemy first. Discipline and coordination were secondary concerns. English armies fought differently. Common soldiers served alongside nobles. Archers protected knights, while knights protected archers. Victory mattered more than individual glory. This difference would prove decisive at Crécy. The march to Crécy. Edward's army landed in Normandy in July 1346. They began immediately devastating the countryside. Towns and villages burned in their wake. The strategy was simple, cause so much damage that Philip would be forced to fight. The English army moved quickly through Normandy, avoiding French strongholds but destroying everything else. They burned Caen, one of Normandy's largest cities. They advanced to within 30 miles of Paris, before turning north toward Flanders. Philip VI followed with his much larger army, but he could not force battle. The English were too mobile and too disciplined. They would only fight when conditions favored them. This frustrated French knights, who were accustomed to glorious charges and decisive battles. The chase continued for weeks across northern France. The English seemed trapped when they reached the Somme River. French forces controlled all the bridges, but English scouts found a ford at low tide. The army crossed at night, staying one step ahead of their pursuers. On August 25, 1346, Edward III chose his battlefield near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The English took position on a low ridge overlooking the road from Abbon. The king deployed his army in 3 divisions, with longbowmen protecting the flanks. The Battle of Crécy. Setup and opening moves. The French army arrived at Crécy in the late afternoon of August 26. Philip VI's forces were exhausted from their long march, but French knights demanded immediate battle. They had been chasing the English for weeks and were eager for combat. The French battle plan was simple. Charge the English position with heavy cavalry. French knights had dominated European battlefields for centuries. Their armor could deflect most weapons, and their horses could break any infantry formation. What could possibly go wrong? Philip VI tried to delay the attack until the next morning. His men were tired and the light was fading. But the French nobility would not wait. They had come for glory, not prudent tactics. Against the king's wishes, they prepared for battle. The English waited calmly on their ridge. Edward III had chosen the position carefully. His archers were protected by stakes and ditches. The ground in front sloped upward, forcing attackers to fight uphill. Most importantly, the narrow front prevented the French from using their numerical superiority. The battle opened with a disastrous French mistake. Philip had hired Genoese crossbowmen to support his cavalry, but when the crossbowmen advanced, they discovered their bowstrings were wet from an afternoon rain shower. Their weapons were useless. Worse, the French knights became impatient. When the Genoese began to retreat, French cavalry charged through their own retreating troops. The crossbowmen were trampled by their own allies. The French army was in chaos before they even reached the English line. The massacre at Crécy. What followed was one of the most one-sided battles in medieval history. Wave after wave of French cavalry charged the English position. Each attack was met by clouds of arrows from Welsh and English longbows. The longbow was a revolutionary weapon. It could pierce chainmail at 200 yards and plate armor at closer range. A skilled archer could shoot 12 arrows per minute. With 5,000 archers on the field, the English could lose 60,000 arrows every minute. French horses were the first casualties. Wounded animals threw their riders and blocked the narrow approaches to the English line. Soon the ground was carpeted with dead and dying horses. Later attacks had to navigate through this obstacle course of corpses. Individual French knights showed incredible bravery. John of Luxembourg, the blind king of Bohemia, tied his horse to his companions and charged the English line. He died fighting, though he could not see his enemies. His sacrifice exemplified the courage and futility of the French attacks. The Black Prince, fighting in his first major battle at age 16, was reportedly knocked down during the fighting. When asked if he needed help, Edward III refused to send reinforcements. "Let the boy win his spurs," the king allegedly said. The prince survived, and indeed earned his reputation that day. By nightfall, the French had made over 15 separate charges. Each had been repulsed with heavy losses. The battlefield was covered with dead French knights. Over 1,500 French nobles died at Crécy, including the kings of Bohemia and Majorca. Aftermath and consequences of the Battle of Crécy changed everything. In a single afternoon, English longbowmen had destroyed the myth of invincible French cavalry. The military revolution that would transform medieval warfare had begun. French casualties were catastrophic. Besides the 1,500 dead nobles, thousands of common soldiers died. An entire generation of French military leadership was wiped out. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical losses. English casualties were minimal. Perhaps 20 men died, including some who were trampled by their own horses. The disparity was so extreme that chroniclers had difficulty believing their own accounts. How could such a small army destroy such a large one? The answer lay in technology and tactics. The longbow gave English armies firepower that could break any cavalry charge. Combined with defensive positions and disciplined troops, this firepower made English armies nearly invincible in pitched battle. But Crécy was just the beginning. The victory opened the road to Calais, France's most important channel port. Edward III laid siege to the city in September 1346. The siege would last nearly a year and demonstrate another English advantage: superior logistics and organization. The Siege of Calais. The Siege of Calais became one of the longest and most important operations of the war. The city was strongly fortified and defended by a determined garrison. But Edward III was prepared for a long siege. He built a fortified camp outside the city and settled in to wait. The English strategy was starvation. They controlled the sea approaches to Calais and gradually tightened their grip on the land routes. French attempts to relieve the city failed. Philip VI assembled several armies but could not break the English siege lines. Inside Calais, conditions became desperate. Food ran out by winter. The garrison expelled useless mouths, civilians who could not contribute to the defense. These people were trapped between the city walls and English siege lines. Many died of starvation. The siege dragged on through the winter of 1346–47 and into the following summer. Both sides suffered from disease and cold, but English supply lines remained open. Ships from England brought food, weapons, and reinforcements regularly. By August 1347, Calais could hold out no longer. The city surrendered, but Edward III was initially inclined to massacre the entire population. Only the intervention of Queen Philippa, according to legend, saved the civilians. The famous story of the burghers of Calais dates from this surrender. 6 prominent citizens offered their lives to save their fellow townspeople. Edward originally planned to execute them, but was persuaded to show mercy. The incident became a symbol of civic virtue and royal clemency. The Black Death interrupts the war. Just as Edward III was consolidating his gains, a new enemy appeared that would dwarf the destructions of war. The Black Death reached Western Europe in 1347, carried by ships from the east. This plague would kill more people in 5 years than the 100 Years' War would claim in a century. The plague struck England first, arriving at the port of Melcombe Regis in June 30. Within months, it had spread across the entire kingdom. Perhaps 1/3 of England's population died. The machinery of government nearly collapsed as clerks, judges, and administrators succumbed to the disease. France suffered even more severely. The plague arrived there in early 1348 and spread with devastating speed. French cities, already weakened by war and siege, were particularly vulnerable. Paris lost perhaps half its population. The French monarchy struggled to maintain basic services. Both sides found it impossible to continue active warfare. Armies could not be raised when soldiers were dying of plague. The few military operations attempted were undermined by disease. In 1348, an English army besieging Calais was forced to retreat when plague broke out in their camp. The social consequences of the Black Death were profound. Traditional authority structures collapsed as priests, nobles, and officials died. Surviving peasants found their labor suddenly valuable and demanded higher wages. The feudal system began its long decline. Religious faith was shaken by the plague's indiscriminate killing. Why would God allow such suffering? Some blamed the Jews and launched violent pogroms. Others joined flagellant movements, believing that extreme penance might end the divine punishment. Renewed warfare. The Battle of Winchelsea. By 1350, both kingdoms had begun to recover from the worst effects of plague. Warfare resumed, but its character had changed. Armies were smaller, and both sides were more cautious about risking major battles. The first significant engagement was a naval battle off Winchelsea in August. This encounter became known as the Battle of Les Espagnols-sur-Mer because it involved Spanish ships fighting alongside the French. Edward III personally led the English fleet, accompanied by the Black Prince and other nobles. They intercepted a Spanish convoy carrying goods to France and Flanders. The Spanish ships were larger and higher than the English vessels, giving them an initial advantage. The battle was fought like a land engagement at sea. Ships grappled together, allowing knights and men-at-arms to board enemy vessels. The English gradually gained the upper hand through superior seamanship and tactics. Several Spanish ships were captured, though others escaped. More importantly, the battle demonstrated English naval supremacy in the Channel. French and Spanish merchant shipping became increasingly vulnerable to English raids. The war spreads. Brittany and Gascony. While the main armies recovered from the plague, Fighting continued in the outlying provinces. Brittany remained disputed territory, with English and French forces supporting rival claimants to the duchy. The war in Brittany took on a particularly brutal character. Both sides used routier companies, bands of professional soldiers who lived by plunder and ransom. These men had no loyalty except to their paymasters and no restraint in their methods. In Gascony, English forces under the Earl of Lancaster conducted a series of successful campaigns. They captured numerous French strongholds and extended English control deep into southwestern France. The French seemed unable to coordinate an effective response. These secondary campaigns served English strategic interests perfectly. They tied down French resources and prevented Philip VI from concentrating his forces for a decisive counterattack. England could afford these multiple fronts because their overall strategy was defensive. The French faced a dilemma. They could not ignore English gains in their outlying provinces, but responding to each threat separately prevented them from achieving decisive success anywhere. This strategic paralysis would plague French efforts throughout the war. John II becomes King of France. In August 1350, Philip VI died and was succeeded by his son John II, known as John the Good. The new king inherited a kingdom ravaged by war and plague, but he was determined to restore French honor and drive out the English invaders. John II was a very different ruler from his father. Where Philip had been cautious and calculating, John was impulsive and brave to a fault. He believed that personal courage and knightly virtue could overcome any tactical disadvantage. The new king immediately began planning a major offensive against English possessions in France. He assembled a large army and prepared to march south against Gascony. This campaign would lead directly to the second great English victory of the war. But first, John had to deal with continuing problems at home. The plague had not only killed people, it had disrupted the entire social order. Peasants demanded higher wages, nobles questioned royal authority, and the church struggled with loss of faith. John's response was characteristically direct. He would restore order through force and restore French pride through military victory. This approach appealed to the French nobility, who had been humiliated at Crécy and were eager for revenge. The Black Prince's Great Raid. In July 1355, the Black Prince landed at Bordeaux with a fresh English army. His mission was to conduct a great chevauchée through southern France, demonstrating English power and French weakness. This raid would prove to be one of the most destructive campaigns of the entire war. The Black Prince's army was relatively small, perhaps 6,000 men, but it was highly mobile and disciplined. More importantly, it included a large proportion of longbowmen and experienced men-at-arms who had learned the lessons of Crécy. The English army moved east from Bordeaux, burning and plundering everything in its path. French resistance was minimal. Local nobles locked themselves in their castles, while their subjects suffered. The contrast with knightly ideals could not have been clearer. Town after town fell to the English advance. Carcassonne, one of the strongest fortresses in southern France, was captured and burned. The psychological impact was enormous. If Carcassonne could not resist, what city was safe? The Black Prince showed no mercy to French civilians. His men burned crops, destroyed mills, and slaughtered livestock. This was economic warfare carried to its logical extreme. The goal was to make French territory worthless to its own king. By winter 1355, the English had penetrated deep into Languedoc, almost reaching the Mediterranean coast. They then turned north, intending to link up with English forces advancing from Normandy. This movement would bring them into contact with King John's army. The campaign leading to Poitiers. King John II had assembled the largest French army since Crécy. Contemporary estimates put his force at over 50,000 men, including the finest knights of France. The king was confident that such overwhelming numbers would finally crush the English upstarts. The Black Prince, meanwhile, was in a dangerous position. His small army was deep in hostile territory, far from any base of supply. If the French could force battle under favorable conditions, the English would be annihilated. The two armies maneuvered around each other, for several days near Poitiers. John II was determined to force battle, while the Black Prince sought to avoid a general engagement. The English were outnumbered, more than 3-1. On September 17, 1356, attempts at negotiation failed. The Black Prince offered to return all his conquests and serve in the French army for 7 years if he and his men could return safely to Bordeaux. John II refused, demanding unconditional surrender. The French king's confidence was understandable. His army was not only larger but better equipped than the English force. French knights had learned some lessons from Crécy and had improved their tactics. Victory seemed certain. But the Black Prince had also learned from experience. He chose his position carefully, placing his army on rising ground behind hedges and vineyards. The terrain would channel French attacks and neutralize their numerical advantage. The Battle of Poitiers. French tactical improvement. The Battle of Poitiers began on September 19, 1356, with both sides having learned from Crécy. The French had modified their tactics to deal with English longbows. Many knights dismounted to avoid presenting easy targets to archers. They also coordinated their attacks better, avoiding the chaos that had marked their earlier defeat. These improvements initially proved effective. The first French assault, led by the Dauphin Charles, actually reached the English line. Hand-to-hand combat was fierce, and for a moment it seemed the French might break through. But English defensive positions held. The longbowmen, protected by stakes and hedges, continued to pour arrows into French ranks. More importantly, English men-at-arms were better organized and more experienced in this type of fighting. The second French attack, led by the Duke of Orleans, also failed to break the English line. French casualties mounted, while English losses remained light. The pattern of Crécy was repeating itself, but more slowly and at greater cost. King John II personally led the third and final assault. This was the cream of French nobility charging uphill against a disciplined enemy. The result was predictable: slaughter on an epic scale. King John's capture at Poitiers. The climax of Poitiers came when King John II himself was surrounded and captured. The French king fought bravely to the end, wielding a battle axe against English knights who were trying to take him alive. His capture marked the complete collapse of French resistance. The scene of the king's surrender became legendary. According to English accounts, John handed his glove to a French exile fighting with the English, saying, "I surrender to you." The capture of a reigning monarch was almost unprecedented in medieval warfare. With their king captured, the remaining French forces fled the field. English cavalry pursued them for miles, killing fugitives and taking prisoners for ransom. The flower of French chivalry was either dead or captured. French casualties at Poitiers were even heavier than at Crécy. Over 2,500 French nobles died, including many of the most important figures in the kingdom. Among the prisoners were the king himself, his son Philip, and dozens of counts and dukes. English losses were again minimal. Perhaps 40 men died, most from accident or disease rather than enemy action. The disparity was so extreme that even English chroniclers seemed embarrassed by their own success. Consequences of Poitiers. France in crisis. The capture of King John II created an unprecedented crisis in France. Never before had a French monarch been taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The very legitimacy of the monarchy seemed in question. The Dauphin Charles, only 18 years old, became regent in his father's absence, but his authority was challenged by the Estates General, the French Parliament, which demanded major reforms in exchange for new taxes to pay the king's ransom. The Estates General was led by Étienne Marcel, provost of the merchants of Paris, and Robert Lecoq, Bishop of Laon. These men used the crisis to demand limitations on royal power and greater control over government finances. In 1357, the Estates forced through the Great Ordinance, which would have made France a constitutional monarchy centuries before England. The Dauphin reluctantly agreed, but began plotting to restore full royal authority as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the English were enjoying the fruits of victory. King John was held prisoner in comfortable conditions, first in Bordeaux and later in London. His ransom was set at the enormous sum of 3 million gold écus, equivalent to several years of French royal revenue. The Jacquerie peasant revolt. The disasters of Crécy and Poitiers had destroyed faith in the French nobility. If knights could not protect the kingdom from foreign invaders, why should peasants continue to serve them? In 1358, this question exploded into violent revolt. The Jacquerie, named after the common peasant named Jacques, began in the countryside around Paris. Peasants attacked noble estates, burning castles, and murdering their inhabitants. The violence was extraordinary, even by medieval standards. The revolt was sparked by immediate grievances: heavy taxes to pay the king's ransom, continued depredations by unemployed soldiers, and the obvious failure of the nobility to fulfill their basic function of protection. But deeper issues were also involved. The plague had killed so many workers that survivors could demand higher wages and better treatment. When nobles tried to maintain old relationships by force, peasants responded with violence. The Dauphin Charles was forced to ally with the nobility against the rebels. In June 1358, a joint army of nobles and royal troops defeated the main peasant force at Mautiers. The suppression that followed was savage. Thousands of peasants were executed. Marcel's revolution in Paris. While peasants revolted in the countryside, Paris itself was in the grip of revolution. Etienne Marcel had used his control of the city militia to challenge royal authority directly. He demanded that the Dauphin govern according to the Great Ordinance. Marcel's revolution had strong popular support among the Paris bourgeoisie. Merchants and artisans saw the monarchy's military failures as proof that new leadership was needed. They welcomed Marcel's promises of fiscal responsibility and administrative reform. The crisis came to a head in February 1358, when Marcel's supporters broke into the royal palace. They murdered two of the Dauphin's close advisors before his eyes, then forced him to wear Marcel's red and blue cap as a sign of submission to the city. But Marcel had overplayed his hand. The murder of royal officials shocked even his supporters. Many Parisians began to question whether revolution was worth the price of civil war. The Dauphin escaped from Paris and began assembling loyal forces outside the city. Marcel responded by negotiating with the English and the King of Navarre, offering to surrender France's capital to foreign enemies rather than yield to royal authority. This treasonous negotiation destroyed Marcel's remaining support. On July 31, 1358, he was killed by his own followers in a street fight near the Porte Saint-Antoine. The revolution was over. The Treaty of Bretigny. By 1359, France was exhausted. King John II remained a prisoner in London. The Dauphin Charles had suppressed the revolts, but the kingdom was bankrupt. The English controlled vast territories and could raid French lands almost at will. Edward III sensed opportunity. In 1359, he launched his largest invasion of France. This time, he intended to march directly to Reims and have himself crowned King of France in the traditional coronation city. The English army that landed in Calais was enormous by medieval standards. Perhaps 10,000 men crossed the Channel, including the Black Prince, John of Gaunt, and the flower of English nobility. This was to be the decisive campaign. But the French had learned hard lessons. The new Dauphin, Charles, refused to give battle. French forces shadowed the English army, but avoided direct confrontation. City after city closed its gates and prepared for siege. The English found themselves winning every battle, but losing the war. They could devastate the countryside, but they could not force the decisive engagement that would bring them the French crown. Winter set in, and the English army began to suffer from cold and disease. On April 13, 1360, a violent hailstorm struck the English army near Chartres. The hail killed hundreds of horses and damaged equipment. Edward III took this as a divine sign and agreed to negotiate seriously. The resulting Treaty of Bretigny was signed on May 8, 1360. The terms seemed to give England everything it had fought for. Edward would receive full sovereignty over Gascony, Poitou, and other territories comprising nearly 1/3 of France. In exchange, Edward would renounce his claim to the French throne and release King John II. The French would pay 3 million gold écus as ransom, the largest sum ever demanded in medieval Europe. The treaty seemed to end the war decisively in England's favor, but it contained a fatal flaw. The territorial transfers were so extensive that France could never truly accept them. The treaty was more an armistice than a genuine peace. King John's death and Charles V's accession. King John II was released from captivity in 1360, but his troubles were far from over. The enormous ransom had to be raised through new taxes that further impoverished his subjects. Worse, several hostages given to guarantee payment had escaped from English custody. John's sense of honor compelled him to return to London voluntarily to replace the escaped hostages. This extraordinary gesture astonished contemporaries, but proved fatal. The former king died in English captivity on April 8, 1364, still a prisoner 4 years after his theoretical liberation. The Dauphin Charles now became King Charles V of France. He had learned bitter lessons during his regency and was determined to restore French fortunes. But he would fight the English with new methods, avoiding the pitched battles that had brought such disaster. Charles V was not a warrior king like his predecessors. He was slight in build, scholarly in temperament, and preferred books to battles. His enemies dismissed him as weak, but they underestimated his intelligence and determination. The new king's first challenge was to restore royal authority within France. The great nobles had grown increasingly independent during the chaos of the previous decades. Some had made separate truces with the English, while others simply ignored royal commands. Charles began by reforming the French military system. He abolished the traditional feudal levies that had failed so catastrophically at Crécy and Poitiers. Instead, he created a more professional army funded by regular taxation. The great companies and Bertrand du Guesclin. The Treaty of Bretigny had created an unexpected problem: unemployment among professional soldiers. Thousands of English and French men-at-arms found themselves without employers when the war officially ended. These soldiers formed into great companies, mercenary bands that lived by plunder and ransom. They terrorized the French countryside, attacking noble and peasant alike. The companies recognized no authority except profit and no law except force. The most notorious company was led by an Englishman known as the Archpriest. His men controlled large areas of central France, extorting tribute from cities and holding travelers for ransom. They had become a plague, worse than the English armies. Charles V found his solution in an unlikely figure, Bertrand du Guesclin, a minor Breton noble who had risen through skill rather than birth. Du Guesclin was ugly, crude, and illiterate, but he was also a military genius who understood the new realities of warfare. Du Guesclin's strategy was simple. He would lead the great companies into Spain, where they could fight for pay instead of plunder. In 1365, he convinced several companies to support Henry of Trastamara's claim to the Castilian throne against Pedro the Cruel. This brilliant maneuver served multiple purposes. It removed the companies from French territory, gained a potential ally in Castile, and gave du Guesclin valuable experience commanding large forces. The Breton knight was learning to think strategically. The Spanish adventure, du Guesclin's intervention in the Castilian Civil War, initially succeeded. Henry of Trastamara was installed as king, while Pedro the Cruel fled to seek help from the English. The great companies had found profitable employment far from France. But the English could not allow French influence to grow in Spain. The Black Prince, now Prince of Aquitaine, agreed to restore Pedro to his throne. In 1367, an English army crossed the Pyrenees to fight alongside their Spanish ally. The Battle of Nájera, fought on April 3, 1367, was another crushing English victory. The Black Prince's tactical genius and English longbows once again proved superior to continental cavalry. Du Guesclin himself was captured and held for ransom. But this victory came at enormous cost. The Spanish campaign bankrupted the Prince of Aquitaine and exhausted his army. Many English soldiers died of disease in the Spanish heat. The Black Prince himself contracted an illness that would plague him for the rest of his life. More importantly, Pedro the Cruel proved unable to pay the English forces that had restored him. English soldiers found themselves unpaid in a hostile country. Many deserted or joined the great companies they had originally fought against. In 1369, Henry of Trastamara murdered Pedro and reclaimed the Castilian throne. The English intervention had ultimately failed. While France gained a valuable ally, Charles V had outmaneuvered his enemies without fighting a single major battle. The renewal of war. Charles V had been carefully preparing for the renewal of war ever since becoming king. He had rebuilt French finances, reformed the military, and gained allies in Scotland and Castile. By 1369, he was ready to challenge the Treaty of Bretigny. The French strategy was revolution. Instead of seeking pitched battles, Charles would rely on sieges, raids, and guerrilla warfare. French forces would avoid English strengths while exploiting their weaknesses. Du Guesclin, ransomed from English captivity, became Constable of France and the king's chief military advisor. His appointment scandalized the French nobility, a minor Breton knight commanding dukes and counts, but Charles valued ability over breeding. The renewed war began with French legal challenges to English rule in Aquitaine. Charles summoned the Black Prince to answer charges in the Paris Parlement. Knowing the English would refuse, this legal fiction provided justification for renewing hostilities. French attacks began simultaneously across multiple fronts. While Du Guesclin besieged English strongholds in central France, other commanders struck in Normandy and Brittany. The English found themselves fighting a dozen separate campaigns. The strategy worked brilliantly. English forces were too scattered to achieve decisive results anywhere. They could still win individual battles, but they could not prevent the steady erosion of their territorial gains. Du Guesclin's War of Attrition. Bertrand du Guesclin revolutionized medieval warfare through his understanding of logistics and intelligence. He avoided battles he could not win, while forcing the English to fight on his terms. Du Guesclin's army was highly mobile and lived off the countryside. They could march faster than English forces weighed down by supply trains and heavy equipment. When the English concentrated against one threat, Du Guesclin's forces would strike elsewhere. The Breton commander also developed an effective intelligence network. French spies monitored English movements and identified weaknesses in their defenses. Local populations loyal to Charles V provided information and support. Most importantly, Du Guesclin understood that time favored France. English possessions in France were expensive to maintain and difficult to defend. Every year of warfare drained English resources, while French strength grew. The English tried repeatedly to force Du Guesclin into open battle, but the French commander was too clever to be trapped. He would retreat when confronted by superior forces, then strike when the English divided their strength. This strategy frustrated English commanders trained in the traditions of Crécy and Poitiers. They had learned to win through superior tactics and discipline, but Du Guesclin refused to let them use these advantages. The Black Death returns. As if warfare were not destructive enough, the plague returned to France in 1369. This second outbreak was less severe than the original Black Death, but it still caused significant mortality and social disruption. The plague struck English garrisons particularly hard. Soldiers crowded into unsanitary fortresses were vulnerable to epidemic disease. Several important English strongholds fell not to French assault, but to plague among their defenders. French forces seemed better able to cope with the plague's return. Charles V had reformed military medicine and improved sanitation in French camps. French armies remained effective even as disease ravaged their enemies. The plague's return also disrupted English supply lines from England. Ships' crews died of disease, making it difficult to maintain regular communication with English possessions in France. This isolation made English positions even more vulnerable. Naval warfare and the Battle of La Rochelle. The renewed war was not fought only on land. Charles V had been building a powerful fleet with help from his Castilian allies. French and Spanish ships began challenging English control of the seas. The decisive naval engagement came at La Rochelle, On June 22, an English fleet under the Earl of Pembroke was intercepted by Castilian ships supporting France. The battle would determine control of the Bay of Biscay. The Castilian fleet used new tactics that neutralized English advantages. Their ships were higher and more heavily armed than English vessels. When the English tried to board, they were met by crossbow fire from elevated positions. The Battle of La Rochelle was a disaster for England. The entire English fleet was captured or destroyed. The Earl of Pembroke and most of his nobles were taken prisoner. English control of the sea routes to Aquitaine was broken. This naval defeat had strategic consequences far beyond the loss of ships. English garrisons in France could no longer count on regular resupply from England. Many were forced to surrender simply because they ran out of food and arrows. The fall of English strongholds. With English naval power broken and French forces avoiding pitched battles, English strongholds in France began falling one by one. Du Guesclin's strategy of patient siege warfare proved devastatingly effective. The process was systematic. French forces would invest in English castle or town, cutting off supplies and communications. Rather than attempt costly assaults, they would wait for hunger and disease to do their work. English commanders found themselves facing an impossible choice: surrender their strongholds or watch their garrisons starve. Many chose surrender, especially when Du Guesclin offered generous terms to those who yielded without resistance. By 1375, English possessions in France had shrunk dramatically. The great territorial gains of the Treaty of Bretigny had been almost entirely lost. England held only Calais, Bordeaux, and a few scattered fortresses. This systematic reconquest was achieved with minimal French casualties. Charles V and Du Guesclin had learned to win through superior strategy rather than superior fighting. The age of knightly valor was giving way to professional calculation. The death of the Black Prince. The English response to French success was hampered by internal problems. The Black Prince, still ruling Aquitaine, was dying slowly of the disease contracted during his Spanish campaign. His illness made effective military leadership impossible. The Black Prince's condition deteriorated throughout the early 1370s. He could no longer mount a horse or wear armor for extended periods. Command of English forces fell to subordinates who lacked his tactical genius and personal authority. On June 8, 1376, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, died at Westminster Palace. His death removed England's most capable military commander and left the kingdom without clear leadership for the continuing war. The prince's death also created a succession crisis. King Edward III was aging and increasingly senile. The Black Prince's son, Richard, was only 9 years old. England faced the prospect of a regency during its most difficult period of the war. Edward III himself died the following year, on June 21, 1377. The old king had lived to see most of his French conquests lost and his kingdom's military reputation tarnished. The great victories of his youth seemed like distant memories. Richard II and the English crisis. The accession of 10-year-old Richard II created exactly the crisis England could not afford. Real power fell to a regency council dominated by the king's uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt was ambitious and capable, but he was also deeply unpopular. His wealth and influence aroused jealousy among other nobles, while his political alliances were viewed with suspicion. England needed unity, but got factional strife instead. The military situation continued to deteriorate. French and Castilian fleets raided English coastal towns with impunity. In 1377, French forces burned Rye, Hastings, and Plymouth. The English Channel, once England's protective moat, had become a highway for enemy raiders. These raids brought the war home to ordinary English subjects in a way that had never happened before. English peasants and townspeople experienced the same terror and destruction that English armies had inflicted on France for decades. The financial burden of continued warfare was crushing England's economy. The great ransoms from Poitiers and earlier victories had been spent. Now England faced the costs of war without the profits of victory. The peasants' revolt. The combination of military defeat, financial crisis, and weak government created the conditions for England's own peasant revolt. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 echoed the French Jacquerie, but was larger and better organized. The immediate cause was a poll tax, imposed to pay for the continuing war. This tax fell equally on rich and poor, creating particular hardship for peasant families. When tax collectors tried to enforce payment, resistance quickly turned violent. The revolt began in Kent and Essex, but spread rapidly across southeastern England. Unlike the French Jacquerie, the English revolt had clear political objectives: the abolition of serfdom, fair rent for land, and the removal of corrupt officials. On June 13, 1381, rebel forces entered London and took control of the city. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the treasurer, holding them responsible for the kingdom's misfortunes. Young King Richard II showed remarkable courage in confronting the rebels personally. At Smithfield, he met their leader Wat Tyler and appeared to agree to their demands. But Tyler was killed during the negotiations, and the revolt collapsed soon afterward. The Peasants' Revolt was brutally suppressed, but its effects were lasting. It demonstrated that England's social order was as fragile as France's had been. During the Jacquerie, military failure abroad was creating instability at home. Du Guesclin's death and legacy. In 1380, France lost its greatest military commander when Bertrand du Guesclin died during the siege of Châteauneuf-de-Randon. The Breton knight's death marked the end of an era in medieval warfare. Du Guesclin had revolutionized military strategy by proving that intelligence and patience could triumph over traditional knightly valor. His methods would influence military thinking for centuries to come. More immediately, Du Guesclin's campaigns had restored most of France to French control. The English had been reduced to a few coastal strongholds, unable to campaign effectively in the French interior. Charles V ordered that Du Guesclin be buried in the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis, an unprecedented honor for a minor noble. The king declared that Du Guesclin had served France better than any man of his generation. The constable's death came at a crucial moment. Charles V himself was ill and would die later that same year. France was about to lose the two men who had orchestrated its remarkable recovery from the disasters of the 1350s. Charles V's death and assessment. Charles V died on September 16, 1380, at the Château de Vincennes. He was only 42 years old, but his reign had transformed France's position in the war. The kingdom he left to his son was unrecognizable from the one he had inherited. Charles V had never won a great battle. Like Crécy or Poitiers, he had never led a cavalry charge or engaged in single combat. Yet he had achieved what no French king before him had managed. He had defeated the English. The secret of Charles's success lay in his understanding that warfare had changed. Victory no longer went to the bravest or most skillful individual warriors, but to the side with better organization, strategy, and resources. Charles had rebuilt French finances through careful administration and new taxation. He had created a professional army that could match English forces in discipline and equipment. Most importantly, he had found commanders like Du Guesclin who could think strategically. Under Charles V, France had also become a truly national state. The king's authority was acknowledged throughout the realm, and his subjects identified themselves as French rather than merely inhabitants of particular regions. The contrast with England was striking. While France had grown stronger and more unified, England was torn by factional strife and financial crisis. The balance of power had shifted decisively in France's favor. Charles VI and the return to instability. Charles VI was only 11 years old when he became king, creating another regency crisis just when France seemed to have achieved stability. Real power fell to the king's uncles, particularly Philip the Bold of Burgundy and Louis of Anjou. The regency was marked by factional conflict and financial extravagance. The uncles reversed many of Charles V's careful reforms and squandered the royal treasure on lavish ceremonies and foreign adventures. Military discipline also declined without Charles V's firm leadership. French armies began reverting to the undisciplined nobility levies that had failed so catastrophically in the 1350s. When Charles VI came of age in 1388, he initially showed promise as a ruler. He dismissed his uncle's advisors and appointed capable men to key positions. For a brief period, it seemed France would maintain its recent gains. But in 1392, disaster struck. While campaigning in Brittany, Charles VI suffered a mental breakdown that would plague him for the rest of his reign. The king became subject to periods of complete madness, during which he did not recognize his own family. Charles's madness created a power vacuum that France's enemies were quick to exploit. The English, despite their own problems, began to hope that French internal strife might restore their fortunes in the war. The Truce of Lolingham. Despite the renewal of internal problems, both France and England were too exhausted to continue active warfare. In 1389, they agreed to the Truce of Lolingham, which was supposed to last 3 years, but was repeatedly extended. The truce did not resolve the fundamental issues that had caused the war. England still claimed sovereignty over French territories, while France refused to accept any permanent English presence on the continent. Instead, the truce simply froze the military situation in place. England retained control of Calais, parts of Gascony, and a few other strongholds. France controlled everything else, including most of the territories granted to England by the Treaty of Bretigny. During the truce, both sides tried to strengthen their positions for the eventual resumption of warfare. England dealt with its internal problems and rebuilt its military forces. France struggled with the king's madness and growing noble factional conflict. The truce also saw attempts at a permanent peace through royal marriage. Richard II of England married Isabella of France, Charles VI's daughter, in 1396, but Isabella was only 6 years old, making the marriage purely political. The Burgundian-Armagnac Civil War began. The most serious threat to French recovery came not from England, but from internal conflict. Charles VI's periods of madness created a power struggle between different noble factions seeking to control the royal government. The main rivals were Louis of Orleans, the king's brother, and Philip the Bold of Burgundy, the king's uncle. When Philip died in 1404, the conflict continued between Louis and Philip's son, John the Fearless. The struggle became personal as well as political. Louis of Orleans was rumored to be having an affair with the Queen, Isabella of Bavaria. John the Fearless spread these rumors to discredit his rival and justify his own ambitions. On November 23, 1407, the conflict turned violent. John the Fearless arranged the assassination of Louis of Orleans in a Paris street. This murder began a civil war that would tear France apart for decades. The assassination divided French nobility into two camps: the Burgundians, supporting John the Fearless, and the Armagnacs, supporting Charles of Orleans, Louis's son. Each side sought foreign allies, including England, Henry V, and English revival. While France descended into civil war, England found new leadership in Henry V, who became king in 4. Henry was everything Richard II had not been: decisive, militarily capable, and politically astute. Henry V immediately began planning to renew English claims in France. He saw the French Civil War as an opportunity to recover the territorial losses of the previous generation. The time for patient waiting was over. The new king carefully prepared his campaign. He rebuilt English finances, reformed the military, and negotiated alliances with Burgundy and other French factions. By 1415, England was ready to return to war. Henry's preparations were thorough and systematic. He studied the campaigns of Edward III and the Black Prince, learning from their successes and failures. He understood that English victories had always depended on careful planning and superior organization. Most importantly, Henry V grasped that the key to success lay in exploiting French divisions. He would not simply invade France, he would intervene in the French Civil War on behalf of whichever side served English interests. Henry V's invasion of France. On August 11, 1415, Henry V landed at Chef de Caen, near Harfleur, with perhaps the finest English army ever assembled for a French campaign. This force of 10,000 men represented years of careful planning and enormous financial investment. Henry's army was different from earlier English expeditions. The king had learned from previous campaigns that success required more than just military victory. He brought carpenters, masons, and administrators to establish permanent English control over conquered territories. The English expedition also reflected new military technologies. Henry's forces included some of the first cannons used by English armies, though these primitive weapons were more psychological than practical in their impact. Most importantly, Henry V had secured Burgundian neutrality through careful diplomacy. John the Fearless agreed not to oppose the English invasion in exchange for Henry's support in the French Civil War. This alliance would prove crucial to English success. The landing at Harfleur was unopposed. French forces were scattered by civil war and unable to coordinate an effective response. The divided French leadership could not decide whether the English invasion was more dangerous than their own internal enemies. Henry's first objective was the port city of Harfleur, which controlled access to the Seine River and the approach to Paris. Capturing this fortress would give England a permanent base for future operations in northern France. The Siege of Harfleur. The Siege of Harfleur began on August 18, 1415, and immediately revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Henry's strategy. The English army was superbly organized and equipped, but medieval siege warfare was always costly and time-consuming. Harfleur was strongly fortified and well defended by a garrison commanded by experienced French knights. The defenders had prepared for a long siege by stockpiling food and weapons. They were determined to make the English pay dearly for every advance. Henry's cannon proved largely ineffective against Harfleur's walls. Medieval fortifications were specifically designed to withstand projectile weapons, and early artillery lacked the power to breach massive stone walls consistently. Instead, the English relied on traditional siege methods, undermining walls, blocking supplies, and waiting for hunger and disease to weaken the defense. This approach was methodical, but slow, consuming precious time and resources. Disease proved to be Henry's greatest enemy during the siege. Dysentery swept through the English camp, killing hundreds of soldiers, including several important nobles. The king himself fell ill, but recovered after several weeks of fever. The Earl of Suffolk died of dysentery during the siege, along with the Bishop of Norwich and many other prominent figures. These losses demonstrated that medieval warfare was as dangerous to besiegers as to defenders. After 5 weeks of siege, Harfleur's garrison finally surrendered on September 22, 1415. The English had won their first objective, but at enormous cost. Nearly a third of Henry's army was dead, wounded, or too sick to continue the campaign. The march to Calais, with his army reduced by disease and his supplies running low, Henry V faced a critical decision. He could remain at Harfleur and consolidate his gains, or he could march overland to Calais and demonstrate English strength throughout northern France. Henry chose the more aggressive option. On October 8, 1415, he set out from Harfleur with approximately 6,000 men, planning to march 160 miles across enemy territory to reach the safety of English-controlled Calais. This decision has been criticized by military historians as recklessly dangerous. Henry's army was weakened by disease, short of supplies, and vastly outnumbered by French forces that were finally beginning to coordinate their response. But Henry understood the psychological dimensions of medieval warfare. A successful march across France would demonstrate French weakness and encourage English allies. Conversely, retreating by sea would make the expedition appear a failure despite the capture of Harfleur. The march began well enough. English forces moved quickly through the Norman countryside, living off the land and avoiding French strongholds. Local peasants, remembering previous English raids, offered little resistance. But French forces were mobilizing under the Constable Charles d'Albret. A large army was assembling at Rouen, while other forces moved to block Henry's route to Calais. The English were walking into a trap. The French response and pursuit. The French response to Henry's invasion was initially confused by the continuing civil war. Burgundian forces refused to fight alongside Armagnac troops, while both factions suspected the other of treasonous negotiations with England. But the threat of English conquest finally forced temporary cooperation between the warring French factions. Charles d'Albret managed to assemble an army of perhaps 20,000 men, though exact numbers remain disputed by historians. This French army represented the flower of the kingdom's nobility. Dukes, counts, and lesser nobles flocked to join what seemed certain to be a glorious victory over the weakened English invaders. The French strategy was simple: block Henry's route to Calais and force battle under conditions favorable to French arms. With their overwhelming numerical superiority, victory seemed assured. French forces succeeded in reaching the Somme River before the English army. They destroyed bridges and held the fords, preventing Henry from crossing. The English found themselves trapped on the wrong side of the river, with French forces closing in. Henry's situation was becoming desperate. His army was running out of food, and many soldiers were still suffering from dysentery contracted during the siege of Harfleur. French cavalry raids harassed English foragers and cut off potential retreat routes. For several days, Henry's army marched eastward along the south bank of the Somme, searching for a crossing while French forces shadowed them on the opposite side. The English were increasingly exhausted and demoralized. Finding the ford at Bethencourt on October 24th, English scouts finally discovered an unguarded ford near the village of Bethencourt. The French had failed to block this crossing, perhaps because they assumed the English would not venture so far upstream. Henry's army crossed the Somme at low tide, with soldiers helping each other through the muddy water. The crossing took several hours, during which the English were vulnerable to attack, but French forces failed to arrive in time. Once across the river, Henry resumed his march toward Calais. But the French army was now directly ahead, blocking the most direct route. Battle was inevitable, and both sides knew it. French commanders were confident of victory. Their army was fresher, larger, and better equipped than the English force. They had learned from previous defeats and were determined to avoid the tactical mistakes of Crécy and Poitiers. Henry V spent the night of October 24th preparing his men for what might be their last battle. English priests heard confessions and administered last rites to soldiers who expected to die the following day. The eve of Agincourt. The two armies camped within sight of each other on the night of October 24th, 1415, near the village of Agincourt. French campfires seemed to outnumber the stars, while the small English force huddled together against the cold and rain. According to English chronicles, Henry V walked among his soldiers during the night, speaking words of encouragement and demonstrating the common touch that made him beloved by his men. Whether this actually happened remains debated, but the story captures Henry's leadership style. French nobles spent the night gambling and boasting about their expected victory. They argued over who would have the honor of capturing King Henry and how the ransom money would be divided. Victory seemed so certain that defeat was literally unthinkable. The contrast between the two camps could not have been greater. The English were outnumbered perhaps 3-1 and fighting for their lives on foreign soil. The French were defending their homeland with overwhelming superiority in numbers and equipment. Rain fell steadily through the night, turning the plowed fields between the armies into a muddy quagmire. This weather would prove crucial to the battle's outcome, though neither side realized it at the time. Dawn broke gray and wet on October 25th, 1450. The feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian would become forever associated with one of the most famous battles in medieval history, the Battle of Agincourt. Deployment and tactics. Henry V deployed his small army in a single line across the narrow field between two woods. This position prevented the French from using their numerical superiority to outflank the English formation. The English battle line was perhaps 1,000 yards wide, with men-at-arms in the center and longbowmen on both flanks. Each archer had planted a sharp wooden stake in front of his position to deter cavalry charges. French forces were deployed in 3 massive divisions, one behind another. The first line consisted entirely of dismounted men-at-arms. Having learned from previous battles that mounted cavalry was vulnerable to English arrows, the French plan was to overwhelm the English line through sheer weight of numbers. Each division would attack in sequence, maintaining continuous pressure until English resistance collapsed. Both sides waited for hours, neither wanting to attack across the muddy field. Finally, around 11 a.m., Henry ordered his army to advance. The English moved forward about 300 yards, then halted and prepared to receive the French attack. This advance brought the English archers within range of the French line. At Henry's command, thousands of arrows arced through the gray morning air. The Battle of Agincourt had begun. The French cavalry charge. The French response to English archery was a cavalry charge by several hundred knights, despite the earlier decision to fight on foot. These nobles could not resist the traditional glory of mounted combat. The charge was a disaster. Horses bogged down in the muddy field while arrows killed both mounts and riders. Those few knights who reached the English line found their horses impaled on archer stakes. Wounded horses threw their riders and fled back toward French lines, disrupting the advancing infantry. The carefully planned French attack was already falling apart before the main forces engaged. The failure of the cavalry charge demonstrated once again that traditional medieval warfare was obsolete. Disciplined infantry with effective missile weapons could defeat any cavalry force, regardless of the knight's individual courage and skill. The infantry melee. The main French assault came from thousands of dismounted men-at-arms advancing across the muddy field. These were the finest warriors in France, equipped with the best armor and weapons money could buy. But the mud that had stopped French cavalry also hindered infantry. Knights wearing 60 pounds of armor found it exhausting to walk across the plowed field. Many arrived at the English line already winded. The narrow front meant that only a fraction of the French army could engage at any one time. Thousands of French soldiers stood helplessly behind their comrades, unable to contribute to the fighting. English longbowmen, having exhausted their arrows, joined the melee with swords and axes. These common soldiers fought alongside English knights in a display of unity that contrasted sharply with French social divisions. The fighting was savage and close quarters. Heavily armored knights grappled in the mud, while lightly armed soldiers stabbed at gaps in enemy armor. The battle became a series of individual combats rather than organized unit actions. The English breakthrough. Despite their disadvantages, French numbers began to tell as the battle continued. The English line started to bend under pressure from the massive French assault. For a moment, it seemed the attack might succeed. But then English reinforcements arrived. Henry V had held back a small reserve, and these fresh troops struck the exhausted French flank at the crucial moment. The French advance stalled and began to collapse. French nobles, weighted down by armor and exhausted by fighting in the mud, found it impossible to retreat effectively. Many fell and were trampled by their own comrades or killed by English soldiers. The English breakthrough created panic in French ranks. Those who could flee did so, abandoning their comrades still trapped in the melee. The French army began to disintegrate. Henry V ordered his men to take prisoners rather than kill defeated enemies. Medieval ransoms were enormously valuable, and the king wanted to profit from victory as well as achieve it. The massacre of the prisoners. Just as English victory seemed complete, French reserves finally entered the battle. A fresh division of French troops advanced across the muddy field, while other forces threatened the English baggage train. Henry V faced a terrible decision. His small army could not guard thousands of prisoners while fighting off new attacks. The king ordered the execution of most French prisoners, keeping only the most valuable for ransom. This order horrified even medieval observers, though it was technically legal under the laws of war when facing renewed attack. English soldiers reluctantly carried out the massacre, killing perhaps 1,500 French nobles. The massacre broke French morale completely. The final French division retreated without engaging, unwilling to share the fate of their slaughtered comrades. The Battle of Agincourt was over. Aftermath and casualties at Agincourt. The French losses at Agincourt were catastrophic. Perhaps 6,000 French soldiers died, including most of the kingdom's military leadership. Among the dead were the Constable Charles d'Albret, the Duke of Alençon, and hundreds of other nobles. English casualties were remarkably light. Fewer than 100 English soldiers died, including the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk. The disparity was so extreme that contemporaries attributed English victory to divine intervention. The prisoners taken at Agincourt included the Duke of Orleans, the Count of Eu, and other high-ranking nobles whose ransoms would enrich English coffers for years. The financial gains from victory were almost as important as the strategic ones. But the most important consequence of Agincourt was psychological. The battle restored English confidence and terrified French resistance. After decades of English defeats, the myth of French military superiority had been shattered once again. Henry V had achieved what Edward III and the Black Prince had accomplished at Crécy and Poitiers, a crushing victory against overwhelming odds that would reshape the balance of power in the 100 Years' War. Henry's return to England. Henry V returned to England in November 1415 to a hero's welcome. The victory at Agincourt had captured the English imagination and restored national pride after decades of military frustration. The King's triumphant procession through London was one of the grandest celebrations in English history. Crowds lined the streets while church bells rang throughout the city. Henry was hailed as a new Arthur, the greatest warrior king since William the Conqueror. But Henry understood that Agincourt was only the beginning, not the end, of his French campaign. The battle had opened opportunities, but exploiting them would require sustained effort and enormous resources. The king spent the winter of 1415-16 raising money and men for a renewed invasion. Parliament voted unprecedented taxes, while nobles contributed their own wealth to the royal cause. England was united as it had not been for decades. Henry also pursued diplomatic alliances that would isolate France internationally. He negotiated with Burgundy, the Holy Roman Emperor, and various German princes. The goal was to surround France with enemies. The Burgundian Alliance. The most important result of Agincourt was the formal alliance between England and Burgundy, signed at Calais in October 1460. John the Fearless agreed to support English claims in France in exchange for Henry's recognition of Burgundian territorial demands. This alliance was crucial because Burgundy controlled much of eastern France and the wealthy Netherlands. With Burgundian support, Henry could threaten Paris from multiple directions while cutting French access to vital economic resources. The Burgundian alliance also gave Henry's cause legitimacy within France. He was no longer simply a foreign invader, but the ally of one of France's most powerful noble houses. This distinction mattered to French subjects deciding where to place their loyalty. John the Fearless had his own reasons for allying with England. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407 had made him many enemies within France. English military support might be necessary for his own survival. Henry's second invasion. In August 1417, Henry V launched his second invasion of France with an army even larger than the force that had won Agincourt. This expedition included nearly 12,000 men and was intended to establish permanent English control over northern France. Henry's strategy was methodical conquest rather than dramatic raids. English forces systematically besieged and captured French strongholds, building a network of bases that could support future operations. The Siege of Caen, which lasted from May to September 1417, demonstrated Henry's new approach. Rather than seeking quick victory, English forces methodically reduced the city's defenses while preventing French relief attempts. French resistance was weakened by continued civil war. Armagnac and Burgundian forces spent more energy fighting each other than opposing the English invasion. This division allowed Henry to defeat French forces piecemeal. By 1419, English armies had conquered most of Normandy and were advancing toward Paris. French military resistance was collapsing as noble factions continued their destructive rivalry. The murder of John the Fearless. On September 10, 1419, John the Fearless was murdered during a meeting with the Dauphin Charles at Montereau. The assassination was revenge for John's earlier murder of Louis of Orleans, but its timing could not have been worse for French resistance to England. The murder was carried out by followers of the Dauphin, effectively ending any possibility of reconciliation between Armagnacs and Burgundians. Instead of uniting against England, France's civil war became even more vicious. Philip the Good, John's son and heir, immediately sought alliance with England against the Dauphin's party. The new Duke of Burgundy wanted revenge for his father's murder and saw Henry V as the means to achieve it. This alliance gave Henry control over Paris itself. Burgundian forces opened the city gates to English armies. In May 14, the French capital was now under foreign occupation for the first time since the Viking raids of the 9th century. The Treaty of Troyes. The English occupation of Paris led to the Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21, 14. This agreement represented the complete triumph of English arms and the apparent end of independent French monarchy. Under the treaty's terms, Henry V married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the mad King Charles VI. Henry was recognized as regent of France and heir to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin Charles. The treaty also partitioned France between England and Burgundy. Henry would rule northern France directly, while Philip the Good controlled the eastern territories. The Dauphin was declared a traitor and outlaw. For the first time since 1066, England and France were to be united under a single crown. Henry's heirs would inherit both kingdoms, creating a dual monarchy that would dominate Western Europe. The Treaty of Troyes seemed to fulfill all of Edward III's original war aims and more. English claims to French territory were not only recognized but extended to include the entire kingdom. Total victory appeared within reach. Resistance in southern France. Despite the Treaty of Troyes, significant French resistance continued in the territories south of the Loire River. The Dauphin Charles maintained his court at Bourges and claimed to be the legitimate king of France. This resistance was supported by French nobles who refused to accept English rule and foreign occupation. They formed the core of what would later become the movement to restore French independence. The so-called Kingdom of Bourges controlled perhaps 1/3 of France, including some of the wealthiest and most populous regions. English victory was far from complete, despite the dramatic diplomatic success at Troyes. Henry V spent the years 1420–1422 trying to reduce this remaining resistance through military campaigns and political pressure. But French loyalists proved remarkably tenacious in defending their independence. Henry V's death. Henry V's triumph was cut short by his death at the Château de Vincennes on August 31st. The great English king was only 35 years old and had ruled for just 9 years. His death changed everything. The official cause of death was dysentery, the same disease that had plagued English armies throughout the war. Henry's final illness was brief but severe, giving him little time to arrange for the succession. Henry's death left the English position in France dependent on an infant heir. Henry VI was only 9 months old when he inherited both the English and French crowns. A regency was inevitable, and regencies were always periods of weakness and instability. The timing of Henry's death was particularly unfortunate because French resistance was beginning to strengthen. The Dauphin Charles had reformed his administration and was preparing new military campaigns. Without Henry's leadership, English resolve began to weaken. Charles VI of France died just 2 months after Henry V, making the infant Henry VI technically King of France as well as England. But holding these crowns would prove far more difficult than winning them. The English regency and its problems. The minority of Henry VI created the same problems for England that earlier minorities had caused for France. Real power fell to the king's uncles, particularly John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, who became regent in France. Bedford was a capable administrator and general, but he lacked his brother's charisma and authority. English nobles who had followed Henry V enthusiastically were less willing to make sacrifices for his infant son. The financial burden of occupying France was enormous and growing. English taxpayers had supported the war when it brought glory and profit, but maintaining garrisons and administrators in hostile territory was expensive and unglamorous. French resistance was also becoming more organized and effective. The Dauphin Charles had learned from earlier defeats and was building a more professional army. The military balance was beginning to shift against England. The Siege of Orleans began in October 1428. English forces began the Siege of Orleans, the key to controlling the Loire River Valley and the approaches to the Dauphin's strongholds in southern France. This siege would become the turning point of the entire war. Orleans was one of the strongest fortresses in France and was defended by a determined garrison under the Count of Dunois. The city's fall would open the road to Bourges and might force the Dauphin's final surrender. But the siege proved more difficult than expected. Orleans was too large to be completely surrounded by the English army, allowing supplies and reinforcements to reach the defenders intermittently. French resistance was stiffening throughout the occupied territories. Local populations were growing tired of English rule and heavy taxation. Guerrilla warfare was becoming increasingly common. The appearance of Joan of Arc. In February 1429, a peasant girl from Domremy arrived at the Dauphin's court, claiming to have received divine visions, commanding her to drive the English from France and see Charles crowned at Reims Cathedral. Joan of Arc was approximately 17 years old and had no military experience, yet she spoke with such conviction about her divine mission that she impressed even skeptical court officials. After extensive questioning, Charles agreed to give her a chance. Joan's appearance at this crucial moment seemed miraculous to French supporters. Here was a simple peasant girl claiming God's direct support for French independence. Her very existence challenged English claims to divine favor. The theological implications were profound. If God truly supported the French cause through Joan's mission, then English victories might be seen as temporary setbacks rather than divine judgment. French morale began to recover. Joan of Arc's mission and preparation. After being accepted at the Dauphin's court, Joan of Arc was subjected to extensive examination by theologians and court officials. They needed to determine whether her visions were genuinely divine or the product of delusion or deception. The investigation lasted 3 weeks at Poitiers. Joan was questioned about her background, her visions, and her understanding of Christian doctrine. Despite her peasant origins and lack of formal education, she impressed her interrogators with her sincerity and theological knowledge. Joan's answers were simple but compelling. She claimed that the Archangel Michael, along with Saints Margaret and Catherine, had appeared to her regularly since she was 13 years old. These heavenly visitors commanded her to save France and see Charles crowned as the rightful king. The examining committee could find no evidence of heresy or deception in Joan's testimony. More importantly, they recognized that her claims could provide exactly the kind of divine legitimacy the French cause desperately needed. Charles VII decided to test Joan's claims by sending her to Orleans with a relief force. If she was truly divinely inspired, she should be able to accomplish what experienced military commanders had failed to achieve. Joan was provided with armor, weapons, and a small military household. She adopted the dress and behavior of a male knight, cutting her hair short and wearing men's clothing. This transformation scandalized some observers, but was necessary for her military role. The banner Joan carried bore the images of Jesus and the angels, with the words Jesus Maria prominently displayed. She refused to carry a sword until one was found buried behind the altar of Saint Catherine de Fierbois, exactly where her visions had told her it would be. The relief of Orleans. Joan's arrival. Joan of Arc arrived at Orleans on April 29, 1429, accompanied by a convoy of supplies and reinforcements. Her appearance electrified the defenders, who had been under siege for 6 months and were beginning to despair. The English siege lines around Orleans were incomplete, allowing Joan's force to enter the city from the east. The English commanders, the Earl of Suffolk and Lord Talbot, had insufficient troops to surround the entire city effectively. Joan's presence immediately transformed the atmosphere within Orleans. The defenders, who had been merely enduring the siege, suddenly believed that divine intervention would bring them victory. Morale soared throughout the city. Joan demanded that the English abandon their siege and return to England. When they refused, she declared that God would drive them from French soil through her intervention. The psychological warfare had begun. The English response was to strengthen their fortifications and prepare for assault. They had defeated French forces consistently for nearly a century and saw no reason why a peasant girl should change their fortunes now. But Joan's confidence was infectious. French soldiers who had been defensive and cautious suddenly became aggressive and optimistic. The very presence of someone who claimed direct divine support changed the entire character of French resistance. The attack on the Tourelles. On May 4, 1429, Joan led her first attack against English positions around Orleans. The target was the fortress of the Tourelles, which controlled the bridge approach to the city from the south. The assault began at dawn, with Joan herself leading the charge. She carried her banner and shouted encouragement to the French soldiers, many of whom were seeing combat for the first time in months. English resistance was fierce. The Tourelles was strongly fortified and defended by experienced soldiers under Sir William Glasdale. English archers poured arrows into the attacking French ranks, causing heavy casualties. But French morale remained high, despite the losses. Joan's presence convinced the attackers that God was on their side and that victory was inevitable. They pressed forward with unprecedented determination. During the assault, Joan was wounded by an English crossbow bolt that pierced her shoulder. She was carried from the field, and English defenders cheered, believing that the death or wounding of the witch would end French resistance. But Joan returned to the battle after having her wound treated. Her reappearance rallied the French attackers, who launched a final assault that carried the Tourelles by storm. The English garrison was overwhelmed and killed or captured. The liberation of Orleans. The fall of the Tourelles forced the English to abandon their other siege works around Orleans. On May 8, 1429, English forces withdrew northward, ending the siege that had lasted 7 months. The liberation of Orleans was celebrated throughout France as a miracle. A city that had seemed doomed to fall had been saved by a peasant girl who claimed divine guidance. French morale reached heights not seen since the early victories of Charles V. Joan's reputation spread rapidly across France and beyond. She became known as the Maid of Orleans, a divinely inspired savior who could accomplish what experienced generals had failed to achieve. The English were shaken by this unexpected defeat. They had grown accustomed to French military incompetence and could not understand how their opponents had suddenly become so effective. More importantly, the liberation of Orleans opened the Loire River Valley to French forces. The road to Reims, where French kings were traditionally crowned, was now accessible for the first time in years. The Loire Campaign. Following her success at Orleans, Joan launched a campaign to clear English forces from the Loire River Valley. Her strategy was to capture the English strongholds that controlled river crossings and supply routes. The first target was Jargeau, held by the Duke of Suffolk with a garrison of several hundred English soldiers. Joan's attack on June 12 was swift and decisive. The town fell in a single day, and Suffolk himself was captured. Next came Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency, both of which surrendered after brief sieges. French forces were moving with unprecedented speed and confidence, overwhelming English resistance before it could organize effectively. The psychological impact of these victories was enormous. French soldiers who had been defeated repeatedly for decades suddenly found themselves winning battle after battle. Joan's presence seemed to make victory inevitable. English commanders in the region found themselves facing an impossible situation. Their scattered garrisons were being defeated piecemeal, while French forces grew stronger with each success. The Battle of Patay. English disaster. The climax of Joan's Loire campaign came at the Battle of Patay on June 8. English forces under Lord Talbot and Sir John Fastolf attempted to halt the French advance, but walked into a devastating ambush. The battle began when French scouts located the English army attempting to establish a defensive position near the village of Patay. Joan and the Duke of Alençon immediately ordered an attack before the English could complete their preparations. French cavalry struck the English vanguard while it was still marching in column formation. The attack achieved complete surprise, and English resistance collapsed almost immediately. Lord Talbot, one of England's most experienced commanders, was captured along with hundreds of his soldiers. English casualties were enormous, while French losses were minimal. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Battle of Patay was as decisive as Agincourt, but in reverse. French forces had achieved the kind of overwhelming victory that English armies had won so often in the past. The military balance was shifting dramatically. Sir John Fastolfe managed to escape with the remnants of the English army, but his retreat became a rout. English morale in northern France was shattered, while French confidence reached new heights. The march to Reims. With English forces in disarray, Joan convinced Charles VII to march to Reims for his coronation. This journey through English-controlled territory was extremely dangerous, but Joan insisted it was essential to legitimize Charles's reign. The march to Reims began on June 29, 1429, with an army of approximately 12,000 men. This force included many of France's most important nobles, who were finally rallying to their king's cause after years of defeat and humiliation. Town after town submitted to Charles as the royal army approached. Troyes, Chalons, and other important cities opened their gates without resistance. English garrisons either fled or surrendered without fighting. The speed of this campaign was remarkable. In less than 3 weeks, Charles's army had marched through the heart of English-controlled France and reached Reims. Joan's presence seemed to make the impossible achievable. English forces were unable to coordinate an effective response to the French advance. The disaster at Patay had scattered their armies, while the psychological impact of Joan's victories undermined their will to resist. The coronation of Charles VII. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral, the traditional site of French royal coronations. Joan of Arc stood beside the throne, holding her banner, as the ceremony that legitimized French resistance to English rule was completed. The coronation was attended by many of France's most important nobles, including former supporters of the English cause, who were now returning to French allegiance. The tide of noble opinion was turning decisively against England. Charles VII's coronation transformed the legal and political situation. He was now the anointed King of France, while the infant Henry VI remained merely a claimant, supported by foreign armies and treasonous nobles. Joan's role in the ceremony emphasized the divine character of Charles's kingship. She had claimed that God commanded her to see Charles crowned, and that mission had now been accomplished. The psychological impact of the coronation extended far beyond France. European opinion, which had generally favored the English cause after Agincourt and Troyes, began to shift toward the newly crowned French king. Joan's changing role and growing opposition. Following Charles VII's coronation, Joan's influence at court began to decline. Her mission to crown the king had been accomplished, and many courtiers believed her usefulness had ended. Joan herself wanted to continue fighting until all English forces had been expelled from France. But Charles VII and his advisors were more interested in diplomatic solutions than military campaigns. The king's cautious approach frustrated Joan, who believed that divine favor required aggressive action against the English invaders. She pressed for immediate attacks on Paris and other English strongholds. Court nobles were also growing uncomfortable with Joan's influence over military decisions. Many resented taking orders from a peasant girl, regardless of her claimed divine inspiration. Financial considerations also played a role in the growing opposition to Joan's aggressive strategy. Extended military campaigns were expensive, and the royal treasury was nearly empty despite recent victories. The attack on Paris. Against the wishes of many advisors, Joan convinced Charles VII to authorize an attack on Paris, the heavily fortified English-controlled capital. This assault would prove to be Joan's first major military failure. Paris was defended by strong walls, and a large garrison under the command of experienced English and Burgundian officers. The city's population was generally hostile to Charles VII and supportive of the English occupation. The French attack on September 8, 1429, was poorly planned and coordinated. Joan's forces lacked the siege equipment necessary to breach Paris's fortifications or the supplies needed for a prolonged siege. During the assault, Joan was wounded by a crossbow bolt in the thigh. This wound was more serious than her earlier injury at Orleans and effectively ended her participation in the attack. The failure at Paris damaged Joan's reputation and gave her enemies at court ammunition to use against her. Critics argued that her divine mission had ended with Charles's coronation and that continued military action was folly. Charles VII used the failure at Paris as justification for ending the campaign season and returning to the Loire Valley. Joan's aggressive strategy had been discredited by this single defeat. Joan's capture at Compiègne. In the spring of 1430, Joan resumed military operations. Despite limited support from Charles VII, she led a small force to relieve the town of Compiègne, which was under siege by Burgundian forces. On May 23, 1430, during a sortie from Compiègne, Joan was surrounded and captured by Burgundian soldiers under John of Luxembourg. Her capture was a catastrophe for French morale and propaganda. The circumstances of Joan's capture remain somewhat mysterious. Some historians suggest that she was betrayed by French nobles who wanted to eliminate her influence, while others argue that she was simply unlucky in battle. Joan's captor, John of Luxembourg, immediately recognized the value of his prisoner. The English government offered enormous sums for Joan's transfer to English custody, seeing her trial and execution as crucial to their propaganda war. The Burgundians eventually sold Joan to the English for 10,000 livres, an enormous sum that demonstrated how important they considered her elimination to their cause. Joan's trial and condemnation. Joan's trial at Rouen was as much a political event as a legal proceeding. The English needed to demonstrate that her victories had been achieved through witchcraft and heresy, not divine favor. The presiding judge was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, who had fled his diocese when it fell to French forces. Cauchon was determined to prove that Joan was a heretic and witch who had deceived the French people. Joan's defense during the trial was remarkable for its theological sophistication. Despite her lack of formal education, she consistently maintained that her actions had been commanded by God and that she was guilty of no crime. The trial lasted several months and involved dozens of charges, ranging from heresy and witchcraft to wearing men's clothing and claiming direct divine revelation. Joan's responses were carefully recorded by court scribes. Joan's steadfast refusal to recant her claims or admit error frustrated her judges. They had expected a simple peasant girl to be easily intimidated, but Joan showed remarkable courage and intellectual ability throughout the proceedings. Joan's execution and its impact. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old and had been active in the war for only 2 years, yet her impact had been transformational. Joan's execution was intended to demoralize French resistance by proving that their savior was a fraud and heretic. Instead, it created a martyr whose memory would inspire French patriots for centuries. Even some English soldiers were reportedly moved by Joan's courage as she faced death. According to witnesses, she called on Jesus and the saints as the flames consumed her, maintaining her faith to the end. The immediate impact of Joan's death was mixed. French morale suffered a temporary blow, while English propaganda claimed vindication for their cause. But the long-term effects would favor France. Charles VII's government carefully avoided any immediate response to Joan's execution. The king could not afford to appear too closely associated with someone who had been condemned as a heretic by the Church. The turning tide. French recovery. Despite Joan's death, the momentum she had created continued to favor France. Charles VII had used the breathing space provided by her victories to rebuild French military and financial resources. The French king surrounded himself with capable advisors like Arthur de Richemont and Georges de la Tremoille, who understood both military strategy and diplomatic necessity. France was becoming a more effective state. English resources, meanwhile, were increasingly strained by the costs of occupation. Maintaining garrisons throughout northern France was enormously expensive, especially as French resistance made tax collection difficult. The death of John, Duke of Bedford, in 1435, removed England's most capable leader in France. Bedford had managed to hold the English position together through skill and determination, but his successors lacked his abilities. More importantly, cracks were appearing in the Anglo-Burgundian alliance that had made English success possible. Philip the Good was beginning to question whether continued alliance with England served Burgundian interests. The Congress of Arras and Burgundian Defection. In 1435, a great diplomatic congress convened at Arras to discuss peace terms for ending the war. Representatives from England, France, and Burgundy attended, along with papal mediators. The English delegation was led by the Archbishop of York and included some of the kingdom's most experienced diplomats. They were authorized to make significant concessions to achieve peace. French representatives were instructed by Charles VII to accept almost any terms that would end the war and recognize his legitimacy as King of France. The kingdom desperately needed peace to recover from decades of devastation. The crucial negotiations, however, were between France and Burgundy. Philip the Good had grown tired of the English alliance and was looking for an acceptable way to abandon it. Charles VII offered generous terms to Burgundy, recognition of Burgundian independence, territorial concessions, and a formal apology for the murder of John the Fearless, 16 years earlier. On September 21, 1435, France and Burgundy signed the Treaty of Arras. Philip the Good abandoned his English alliance and recognized Charles VII as the legitimate King of France. The collapse of English France. The Burgundian defection exposed English positions throughout northern France to coordinated French attack. Without Burgundian support, English garrisons found themselves isolated and outnumbered. Paris fell to French forces in April 1436 after the Burgundian garrison abandoned the city. The English had lost their most important stronghold and symbol of their dominance in France. French reconquest proceeded systematically over the following years. Charles VII had learned from Joan of Arc's example and maintained steady pressure on English positions rather than seeking dramatic victories. English resistance was hampered by financial problems and political instability at home. The minority of Henry VI continued, while noble factions fought for control of government policy. By 1445, English possessions in France had been reduced to Calais and parts of Normandy and Gascony. The great territorial gains of Henry V had been almost entirely lost. The Truce of Tours and marriage diplomacy. In 1444, England and France agreed to the Truce of Tours, which was supposed to last until 1446, but was repeatedly extended. This truce gave both sides a breathing space to consolidate their positions. The truce was sealed by the marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou, niece of Charles VII. This marriage was intended to create lasting peace between the two kingdoms. But the marriage proved politically disastrous for England. Margaret of Anjou was strong-willed and ambitious, quickly becoming involved in English factional politics. Her French connections made her suspect to many English nobles. During the truce period, Charles VII continued to strengthen French military capabilities. He created a professional standing army, funded by regular taxation, giving France a permanent military advantage over feudal levies. The French also improved their artillery significantly during this period. French cannon became some of the most advanced in Europe, giving them crucial advantages in siege warfare. The final English defeats, Normandy and Gascony. The truce ended in 1449, when fighting resumed in Normandy. French forces, now superior in both numbers and equipment, quickly overwhelmed English resistance. The Siege of Rouen, the English capital in Normandy, lasted only a few weeks in 1449. French artillery breached the city's walls with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. By 1450, all of Normandy had fallen to French forces. English rule in the duchy that William the Conqueror had brought to England nearly 4 centuries earlier was finished. The final campaign came in Gascony, where English rule had lasted for 3 centuries. In 1453, French forces besieged Bordeaux, the last major English stronghold. The Battle of Castillon, on July 17, 1453, was the final engagement of the 100 Years' War. French artillery destroyed an English relief army under John Talbot, effectively ending English hopes of retaining any French territory except Calais. The end of the war and its immediate aftermath. The fall of Bordeaux in October 1453 marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War, though no formal peace treaty was ever signed. England retained only the port city of Calais from all its once vast French possessions. The silence following Castillon was profound. For over a century, warfare between England and France had been the defining feature of Western European politics. Suddenly, this constant conflict was over. English reaction to the final defeat was muted. The kingdom was already sliding toward the civil war that would become known as the Wars of the Roses. Domestic concerns overshadowed the loss of foreign territories. French celebrations were similarly restrained. The kingdom was exhausted by generations of warfare and needed time to heal. Charles VII focused on reconstruction rather than triumphant commemoration. The transition from war to peace was remarkably swift. Trade resumed between the two kingdoms within months. English merchants returned to French ports while French goods appeared in English markets. Many English soldiers who had spent their careers fighting in France found themselves unemployed. Some returned home to become farmers or craftsmen, while others joined the retinues of great nobles preparing for domestic conflict. French recovery was more systematic. Charles VII implemented administrative and military reforms that would make France the dominant European power for the next 3 centuries. The human cost, demographics and destruction. The 100 Years' War had devastating demographic consequences for both kingdoms, though France suffered far more severely than England. Population losses were enormous, and recovery took generations. France lost perhaps 1/3 of its population during the war period, though the Black Death was responsible for more deaths than military action. Some regions, particularly in the north and west, were virtually depopulated. English losses were much lighter in absolute terms, but still significant relative to the kingdom's smaller population. The flower of English nobility had been killed in French campaigns over more than a century. Economic destruction was even more severe than population loss. Northern France had been systematically devastated by English chevauchés and French scorched earth tactics. Recovery required decades of patient rebuilding. Agricultural production had collapsed in many regions. Fields lay fallow, mills were destroyed, and livestock had been slaughtered. The very basis of medieval economy had to be reconstructed. Urban centers had suffered differently, but no less severely. Many French cities had been repeatedly besieged, captured, and sacked. Their populations had fled, and their commercial networks had been disrupted. The transformation of warfare. The 100 Years' War marked a fundamental transformation in medieval warfare. The longbow, gunpowder weapons, and professional armies had made traditional knightly combat obsolete. The English longbow had dominated the first half of the war, making heavy cavalry charges suicidal against disciplined infantry. The age of mounted knights was ending, though few contemporaries realized it. Artillery had proven even more revolutionary than archery. By 1450, French cannon could breach any medieval fortification within days or weeks. The great stone castles that had dominated medieval strategy were becoming worthless. Professional armies were replacing feudal levies throughout Western Europe. Charles VII's ordnance companies became the model for standing armies that would dominate European warfare for centuries. The social implications were profound. Warfare had once been the exclusive domain of the nobility, but now common soldiers with longbows or cannon could kill the greatest knights. Military effectiveness mattered more than social rank. The economic burden of these new military technologies was enormous. Only centralized states with effective taxation could afford professional armies and artillery trains. This requirement accelerated the growth of royal power. The rise of the nation-state. The 100 Years' War accelerated the development of national consciousness in both England and France. Subjects began to think of themselves as English or French, rather than merely inhabitants of particular regions. In France, this nationalism was closely linked to resistance against foreign occupation. The English presence had forced French subjects to choose between loyalty to their traditional lord and loyalty to their country. Joan of Arc had been crucial in crystallizing this French national feeling. Her claim that God favored France against England gave religious sanction to what was essentially a political concept. English national identity had developed differently, but no less significantly. The war had created a sense of English distinctiveness from continental Europe while strengthening ties between England's different regions. Both kingdoms emerged from the war with stronger central governments and clearer national boundaries. The medieval world of overlapping jurisdictions and divided loyalties was giving way to the modern state system. The concept of sovereignty had been clarified by the war's territorial disputes. By 1453, it was clear that England and France were separate kingdoms with distinct governments, laws, and interests. Economic consequences and recovery. The economic impact of the 100 Years' War varied dramatically between the two kingdoms. France had been devastated but would recover to become Europe's wealthiest nation, while England had been enriched but would face new challenges. French agriculture had been systematically destroyed during the war. But this destruction ultimately facilitated agricultural innovation. New farming techniques and crop rotations were introduced as lands were brought back into cultivation. English agriculture had been less directly affected by warfare, but faced different problems. The war's end removed the profitable market for English wool and grain, provided by armies in France. Trade patterns had been fundamentally altered by the conflict. The old commercial networks linking England and France had been disrupted and would take decades to rebuild. The financial systems of both kingdoms had been transformed by the war's demands. New forms of taxation, borrowing, and administration had been developed to support military operations. France emerged from the war with a more efficient fiscal system than England. Charles VII's reforms had created sustainable sources of royal revenue that would fund French expansion for centuries. English finances, by contrast, had been exhausted by the war's final phases. The kingdom's debt was enormous, and its tax system was inadequate to support major military operations. Social and cultural changes. The 100 Years' War had profound social consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. Traditional hierarchies had been challenged, and new forms of social organization had emerged. The French nobility had been decimated by military disasters from Crécy to Castillon. Entire noble families had been wiped out, creating opportunities for social advancement among survivors. English society had also been transformed, though less violently. The war had created new forms of wealth and status, while demonstrating the military value of common soldiers. The concept of chivalry had been fundamentally challenged by the war's realities. Traditional knightly virtues seemed less relevant when peasant archers could kill armored nobles at long range. Literature and art had been influenced by the war's themes and experiences. The conflict had produced new forms of historical writing and national literature in both kingdoms. Religious attitudes had also evolved during the war. Joan of Arc's divine mission had demonstrated the possibility of direct divine intervention in political affairs, influencing popular piety. The role of women had been affected by the war's demographic impact. With so many men killed in battle, women had assumed greater economic and social responsibilities in both kingdoms. The legacy of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc's brief career had lasting consequences that extended far beyond her military victories. She had become a symbol of national resistance and divine sanction that would influence French consciousness for centuries. The process of Joan's rehabilitation began almost immediately after the war's end. Charles VII ordered a new trial that overturned her condemnation and declared her a martyr rather than a heretic. Joan's example had demonstrated the possibility of social mobility in times of crisis. A peasant girl had risen to command armies and influence kings, challenging traditional assumptions about social hierarchy. Her claim to divine inspiration had legitimized resistance to established authority in certain circumstances. This precedent would influence later religious and political movements throughout Europe. The cult of Joan of Arc grew steadily after her death, eventually leading to her canonization as a saint. In 1920, she had become France's patron saint and national symbol. Joan's military methods had also influenced French strategic thinking. Her emphasis on aggressive action and popular support became hallmarks of French military doctrine. The transformation of England. England emerged from the 100 Years' War as a fundamentally different kingdom from the one that had begun the conflict in 1337. The changes were political, social, and cultural. The loss of French territories forced England to develop a more insular identity. The kingdom could no longer see itself as part of a cross-channel empire, but had to become a purely English state. Parliament had gained significantly in power during the war, as kings had needed parliamentary consent for the taxation necessary to fund military operations. This development would have long-term constitutional significance. The English language had been strengthened by the war's nationalist sentiment. French had gradually ceased to be the language of the English court and nobility, replaced by vernacular English. English maritime interests had been encouraged by the loss of continental territories. Unable to expand by land, England would increasingly look to the sea for wealth and glory. The war's end coincided with the beginning of England's greatest internal crisis, the Wars of the Roses. Many of the military leaders and techniques developed in France would be turned against domestic enemies. The rebirth of France. France's recovery from the devastation of the 100 Years' War was remarkably rapid and complete. By 1500, the kingdom had become the dominant European power. Charles VII's military and administrative reforms had created the foundations for French expansion. The standing army and professional bureaucracy would serve French kings well in future conflicts. French artillery had become the finest in Europe during the war's final phases. This technological advantage would be crucial in the Italian wars that began in the 1490s. The kingdom's population recovered quickly from wartime losses. Immigration from neighboring regions and higher birth rates among survivors restored demographic strength within a generation. French agriculture had been modernized during the Reconstruction process. New techniques and crops increased productivity significantly above pre-war levels. The monarchy had emerged from the war with greatly enhanced prestige and power. Charles VII and his successors would use this authority to transform France into Europe's greatest kingdom. Long-term strategic consequences. The 100 Years' War established patterns of Anglo-French rivalry that would persist for centuries. Though the immediate conflict was over, competition between the two powers continued in different forms. England's expulsion from France forced the kingdom to seek expansion elsewhere. The eventual development of English overseas empire can be traced partly to this exclusion from continental Europe. France's victory established the kingdom as the dominant continental power. But this dominance would be repeatedly challenged by coalitions of other European states. The war had demonstrated the importance of naval power in determining the outcome of conflicts between island and continental powers. Both kingdoms would invest heavily in their navies. Colonial rivalry would replace territorial conflict in Europe as the main arena of Anglo-French competition. The techniques and attitudes developed during the 100 Years' War would be transferred to global theaters. The balance of power concept that would dominate European diplomacy for centuries had its origins in the coalitions formed during the later phases of the war. Technological and military innovation. The 100 Years' War had been a laboratory for military innovation. New weapons, tactics, and strategies developed during the conflict would influence warfare for centuries. The longbow's dominance had been relatively brief but decisive. Its impact on medieval warfare was comparable to that of gunpowder weapons on early modern conflict. Artillery development had accelerated rapidly During the war's later phases, French investment in cannon technology would give them crucial advantages in subsequent conflicts. Fortification design had begun to adapt to gunpowder weapons, though the full implications of this technological revolution would not be apparent until the 16th century. Professional military engineering had emerged from the war's siege operations. The specialists who designed fortifications and conducted sieges would become increasingly important in later conflicts. Naval technology had also advanced significantly during the war. Improvements in ship design and navigation would contribute to the age of exploration that followed. The end of the medieval world. The 100 Years' War marked the transition from medieval to early modern Europe. Many of the characteristic features of medieval civilization had been challenged or destroyed during the conflict. Feudalism as a military system had been proven obsolete by the war's battles. Professional armies had replaced feudal levies as the dominant form of military organization. The universal authority of the Church had been weakened by the competing claims of English and French clergy during the war. National churches were beginning to emerge. The concept of knightly honor had been challenged by the practical requirements of effective warfare. Military efficiency mattered more than adherence to chivalric ideals. Traditional forms of authority had been questioned by the social mobility created by warfare. Merit and ability were becoming more important than birth and inheritance. The war's place in European history. The 100 Years' War was more than just a conflict between England and France. It was a defining event in the development of modern European civilization. The war had accelerated political developments that might otherwise have taken centuries to unfold. The modern state system emerged from the crucible of sustained international conflict. Military technology had advanced more rapidly during the war than in any previous period. The techniques developed would shape warfare until the Industrial Revolution. Social mobility had increased dramatically during the war, challenging traditional hierarchies and creating new opportunities for advancement. National consciousness had crystallized during the conflict, creating the foundation for the nationalism that would dominate later European history. Conclusion: the war's ultimate meaning. The 100 Years' War had begun as a dynastic dispute over feudal inheritance rights. It ended as a conflict between emerging nation-states fighting for territory and prestige. Both kingdoms had been transformed by the experience. England had been forced to abandon continental ambitions and develop insular identity, while France had been united under strong royal authority. The human cost had been enormous, but the political and cultural consequences were equally significant. Medieval Europe had died in the battlefields of France, and early modern Europe had been born. The war established patterns of international conflict that would persist for centuries. Competition between great powers, the importance of military technology, and the role of popular nationalism all had their origins in this prolonged struggle. Joan of Arc's peasant origins and divine mission had demonstrated that individuals could change the course of history. Her example would inspire generations of later leaders and movements. The transformation of warfare during the conflict had made military service more dangerous, but also more socially mobile. Common soldiers could now influence battles that determined the fate of kingdoms. Most importantly, the war had shown that no political arrangement was permanent. The mighty English Empire in France, which had seemed unshakable after Agincourt and Troyes, had collapsed within a generation. The 100 Years' War was thus not just a medieval conflict, but the first modern war. Its lessons about the importance of national unity, technological innovation, and popular support would echo through subsequent centuries. As we close this long and complex story, we can see that the 100 Years' War was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the medieval world of feudal obligations and universal empire, while beginning the modern world of nation-states and gunpowder armies. The knights and longbowmen, the castles and cannon, the kings and peasants who shaped this conflict would fade into history, but their struggle had created the foundations upon which our modern world was built. The war that began with Edward III's claim to the French throne in 1337 had ended with the emergence of England and France as the distinct nations we know today. In 1116 years of conflict, medieval Europe had been transformed forever. And so ends the complete history of the 100 Years' War. A conflict that shaped two nations, transformed European warfare, and marked the transition from medieval to modern times. May this tale of knights and cannons, of victories and defeats, of transformation and rebirth, carry you gently into peaceful sleep.